Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Ivins. I'm the director of the Colorado State University McNair Scholars Program. And today I'm very excited to present a preliminary study of potential analysis techniques for our scholar data. This could apply to any TRIO program or student success program. So I'll get into it a little bit. We're not really going to be drawing a lot of conclusions for this study. Our sample size is quite small. This really is just to investigate those techniques. So I'll dive right in. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, awesome. So let's get this into presentation mode. This is part of our Student Success Tech series. You may have seen one of these videos before. And again, we're looking at this success plus engagement preliminary analysis. This study was conducted by myself and one of our GAs, Webb, who did a spectacular job on the R portion of this analysis. This is our table of contents of what we'll talk about. Of course, I'm going to introduce the project, give you the methodology, and then results for our two different pieces. This is a mixed methods analysis. I'll give you the quantitative portion of the analysis, those results, and then the NLP results. Then we'll do a discussion, some of the key findings, talk about limitations, and then our future work. And of course, there'll be a references slide at the end. So in case you don't have a ton of context on the McNair Scholars Program, please do look it up. This is a TRIO program across, 150 different colleges and universities in the United States. It serves as a pathway for low income and first generation and underrepresented students in graduate education to pursue graduate studies. This preliminary work is just going to explore some techniques that could be used to gain insights. And as always, we very much appreciate your feedback. This study is specifically going to look at the relationship between a scholar engagement measurement that we have modeled and some comparison pairs that make a lot of sense for McNair. So I'm going to, as it says in the summary, refer to low income and first generation as LIFG versus non-LIFG. And then we're going to look at grad school entry, grad school enrollment, yes, no variable. We want to look at the effectiveness of current programming, of course, areas for improved student support. On that portion of the analysis, we are going to get some conclusions. We do have a decent sample of data for that portion, but we're going to be careful. Again, this is a mixed methods analysis. We're looking at some tests of significance and confidence intervals, and we're going to do some GenAI NLP. This one's kind of interesting. We've done a custom NLP for the TRIO SSS program here at CSU. And what I want to look at here is, can we use out of the box Gen AI for such an analysis? Can we do this in a way that's reasonable and rigorous? That's a good question. So yeah, these are our whys, kind of goes over, what we just discussed, right? We want to look at some potential, quantitative measures of success, qualitative patterns in student support. In our future work, we'd like to combine the two, more on that later. We want to analyze the effectiveness of current programming and then look at some of the patterns in our interactions with students and, like what needs additional emphasis. So it's kind of like, what do our meetings focus on now? What should we look at in the future? Where are there some gaps? And again, of course, we want to explore the utility of out of the box Gen AI, maybe a little controversial. We'll see. All right, so methods, what we'll go over in the quantitative analysis, we're going to talk about the sample and variables, measuring engagement, the description of the test that we use. And of course, for the NLP, we're actually going to have a different sample, so we're going to want to go over that. Setting up the purpose of our contact notes analysis, the rationale for Gen AI platforms that were selected, and the description of our prompting. Let's start with quantitative analysis, right? We're going to start with that sample and variables and go through. So here are the definitions of all of our comparisons. What we're doing here is Wilcox and rank sum tests and confidence intervals for four really key groups for us. We're going to look at LIFG, underrepresented, STEM, and graduate school entry. And we're going to do this on three quantitative variables: GPA, that engagement score that I mentioned that we modeled, and funding per scholar. Now, I will say that really for this presentation, we're going to focus on engagement. Definitions of our comparison pair of variables, all of them are binary, yes, no. So you can read those there. Again, I will make this available to you all. Description of our sample. So here's where you're going to see a limitation right off the bat, right? We've got 17 participants who graduated or are graduating by spring 2025. The McNair Scholar Program at CSU is fairly new. So we can't use any of our future graduates, right? We can only use the small sample that we have. But again, here we're just kind of exploring potential techniques. You're going to see another limitation, a big one, when you look at demographics. Yes, these groups are very imbalanced. And that makes sense given our criteria, right? So underrepresented 14, yes, 3, no. Doesn't really get much more imbalance than that. So our other qualitative variables that we have that we collected some information on was transfer. We're not really going to talk about that much. STEM, and then grad entry, 10 yes, 7 no. So again, those imbalances are certainly an issue. If you're an SSS group, you wouldn't have some of these outcomes, but I could see, given the, sample sizes that you all have, I could see us extending this, to perhaps some other qualitative variables that you might be interested in. Descriptions of those, just want to make sure that everyone has that context, right? GPA, this is very traditional, and we gathered them from Webb, which is our student record system. Funding per scholar, what we're looking at here is really just SRI stipends and individual travel costs. So again, that part of this is this very preliminary kind of idea of maybe looking at, okay, when we spend a lot of funds on a scholar, are we doing this in such a way that support is promoting graduate school entry and attainment? So here's engagement. So engagement is a continuous variable, right? And what we're trying to assess is, as it states, a scholar's level of engagement with our program. So engagement scores are calculated for programs like ours, typically, government support programs. And it's interesting because the overall idea of an engagement score, this is fairly common, but there is no one size fits all calculation. So what we're doing here is thinking of all of the activities, right, that we have in our program as relative parts of a whole. And I'll show you a table on the next slide of how this works and how we came to this formula below. So you can see some of the items there, much easier to view in this table. So here's what we're looking at. We're looking at 11 activities split into 3 domains. These values didn't come from nowhere. Where these values come from is what the objectives of the McNair program are, right? So the main objective being that we increase graduate degree attainment for groups that are underrepresented in graduate school. So when we look at that piece plus our annual performance report objectives to the Department of Education, these are very reasonable values based on those requirements and based on the objectives of the program. So we, of course, are going to put a lot of stock into like the graduate application process and support. Then, of course, the big support component for McNair is research. So looking at our summer research internship, abbreviated there as SRI, or perhaps a student participated in an REU, or perhaps a private internship. We go to the University of New Mexico every year for group conference travel, where the scholars present their summer research. Maybe scholars visited a graduate school, maybe they went to a field-specific conference travel, right? We want to take those into account. Are they meeting with me to work on their research action plan? Are they presenting at CSU murals and circ? And then some holistic, so cultural travel, where we're looking at things like NCORE, SACNAS, for example. Single day events like orientation, welcome back, the SRI course. These are really centered around cultural and holistic support. So our SRI course is a little bit different maybe than some of the other McNair programs out there. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about how we kind of do that. So you can see that the weights, the absolute weights, all the way on the right, those total to 1. We're looking at this as a proportion. So let's look at our engagement distribution. This is going to be very important. So we actually took our engagement scores that we calculated for each scholar from the formula from slide 9, right? From the table on slide 10. And what we did is we transformed them using inverse logic in R. So we're taking numbers on a real line, okay, converting to 0, 1, right, with the specific intent to convert to probability, right? So a visual of this is here on the right. You can see this is heavily skewed data. And of course, that's going to inform the kind of tests that we conduct. So for natural language processing, there are going to be 2 components of this. So we're going to do this big overview of all contact notes between the assistant director and all scholars. So we're going to have a good sized data set. We're going to have 131 total contacts on 41 scholars. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this portion in 3 phases. So phase 1 is going to be this broad request to ChatGPT to see if it can conduct an NLP, like just something very rudimentary. Hey, ChatGPT, run an NLP. Let's do it using, these components. And then identify some key themes in phase 2. And then phase 3, how about some recommendations, gaps, and things like that? So a little note at the bottom, a description of TRIO and the McNair program's mission and goals were provided to ChatGPT for context. The second portion of this analysis is a case study, and this one is very exciting. So I can say that here we got some actionable, meaningful results that can translate to your program. So if you're a director of a student success program of any kind, particularly I'd say of TRIO, if you're using, like student access, this is going to be great. We have another video on that if you'd like the how-to. What we're using here is Claude Sonnet 3.7, and the prompt is here, and essentially it says, hey, given our goals for the TRIO McNair program, what gaps should we address? And if you think about the background of this, so to give a little bit of context, the idea here is this. You are an advisor, right? You're a retention specialist. You're an assistant director, and you're about to go into a meeting with a student. For SSS, you all have such large, you have such a large caseload that if you think about that prep, and you might have 5 minutes to prep for a meeting with a student, how can you really do that effectively? Well, one way would be to very quickly, you can do this in less than 5 minutes, right? Again, the other video has the how-to, but the idea is for you to be able to pull your contact notes, run an analysis with Sonnet, to get contacts on like some context on all of the meetings that you've had maybe for that semester, or maybe what the meetings looked like the prior semester. Given, this, any important notes about this specific student, what are the recommendations? So this one was super valuable. Very excited to talk about it. So our results. So for the quantitative analysis, what I'm going to do is give some summary statistics that we calculated. Again, those tests of significance, confidence intervals. And then for the NLP, this is interesting. And if you look at the preliminary paper, I give the raw output. I kind of went back and forth on whether or not I should give raw output or, refine it for academic work. And I decided for the preliminary to give the raw output. So if you look at the paper, you can see exactly what that looks like when you make this request from ChatGPT, when you make a request from Claude. So we're going to give the raw output for the contact notes and the case study in that preliminary paper. We pare it down and edit a bit for this presentation. So let's talk about the quantitative analysis. So our big takeaway here is that small sample sizes are going to limit any kind of statistical significance. That being said, statistical significance is a tricky topic, and I highly encourage you to go to the final slide that contains references and look at the American Statistical Association's discussion of the pitfalls of statistical significance. We want to look at CIs to maybe get some notable insights, and certainly for future studies, right? Or studies on SSS data to get some insights. Overall sample, right? So we've got a GPA mean of 3.51. That's great, makes a lot of sense for our program. We do set a threshold for minimum GPA that was written into our grant. That can be a little controversial. Again, please reach out if you want to have a conversation about that. Transformed engagement, we're seeing a mean of 0.67. We're pretty happy about that when we think about kind of the scale of this data. The median is very similar to the mean, and that standard deviation of post-transformation is quite low. Funding per scholar. So looking at this is why we're not going to really discuss this variable any further in this study. Hopefully we can get some insights in the future, but look at that standard deviation. Oh my goodness. Okay, so results of engagement comparisons. Again, I want to focus on that variable. We're seeing, we think, again, right? Very preliminary. But it's looking like we've got some pretty similar engagement levels, regardless of background, and that's great. That's what we'd like to see. We'd like to see that we're engaging scholars, in these groups. So low income first gen versus non, underrepresented versus non. We would like to see that we're engaging these groups at similar or the same level. STEM result might be a little ambiguous, so we're not super sure about that yet. It's a group that we want to watch really closely going forward. Potentially a notable difference that we might see in the future, we're getting a little glimmer of it here, is grad school entry is looking like it's related to higher engagement scores. And you noticed, I'm sure, that in engagement score, we use some grad application components there. I'll talk about that more in the discussion. Again, very important note. These groups are very unbalanced. The sample size is quite small. Now, I will say that something that's going to come into play here when we discuss this is the scale of this data for engagement is quite small. And that's going to come into play, right? So the max minus the min there, 0.19. Here are the results of our significant tests. So Wilcox and rank sum, right? Why are we doing that? You remember seeing that skewed distribution. So we want to use a Wilcox and rank sum test. Again, the validity of statistical using statistical testing and p-values. Please do look at that American Statistical Association study. Confidence intervals, we're using a different estimate here. So we're using a Hodges-Lehmann estimate. Again, we've got really small sample sizes and skewed data. One thing I want to point out here is, see this right here, this CI. It's really important that you know the order. For any group, this is no minus yes. That's important. So yeah, looking at our results here, right, we've got a visual of what we have here. Again, we're using a Hodges-Lehmann estimate, and then we've got our CI. So here's our key, right? This is grad entry, a little interesting, okay, a little interesting. LI and first gen, STEM in blue, and then under in purple. So here I just want to note, right, we'll discuss this shortly, but I do want to note the size of the estimate we're seeing here, right? So we're seeing an estimate here, negative 0.05. This confidence interval goes to about negative 0.11. Again, no minus yes, right? So looking at this, it's kind of interesting. Zero does sneak into from by rounding, right? Zero sneaks into this CI. But if we think about what a 95% CI is, we kind of look at this lower bound and we go, wow, okay, the scale of this data is only, negative 0.19, right? And we've got this lower bound estimate of over negative 0.11. We might be seeing a glimmer of something here. Again, STEM, let's keep an eye on that. It's just so hard. This group is so unbalanced, right? 14 and 3. Just don't want to say really anything about it yet. Very preliminarily, we're thinking the engagement is looking the same. Very hard to say anything. Okay, let's shift to the NLP. We're going to start with the contact notes analysis. This is that analysis on all scholar data with the assistant director. So the assistant director provides the primary meeting support for scholars. Myself as the director, I provide support on research, and that will be important when we think about the gaps that are going to be pointed out, right? That maybe those aren't really gaps, maybe those things are provided in other programming, but that's for us to analyze. So here, what we did is phase one, right, where we are asking for this broad NLP analysis from ChatGPT, as maybe kind of expected, was not super useful. It wasn't very good, right? It exposed a lot of flaws. So what we did in phase two is just kind of let's pick it apart, right? Let's really use the human part of the human AI collaboration to select topics first, right? So we're going to use ChatGPT to find these top meeting topics. And then what we'll do is within each, we're going to do this exploration of sentiments, and then we're going to have it build clusters. So top meeting topics, we've got work. Now, it's important that work typically had to do with courses. And that's going to come up, and that's going to be really important, right? Coursework in academics was commonly what work was associated with. And then you see in 4, we've got studying, and then we've got study in 8 as well. I like a lot of things I'm seeing here. Support, right, is a top topic. Next steps, right? This suggests that we're looking to the future, we're being proactive, loving that. So the overall, when we look at all of these topics, very positive. Now, I want to make a note here. I included some sample entries, and I looked through quite a few myself. And what I want to point out here is these are not like false positives. In other words, these are not due to American nomenclature where someone says, "How are you doing?" and they say fine and good. What we actually notice is like ChatGPT actually did a pretty good job, right? Looking at some of these quotes here, and again, I looked at quite a few others, the student was rested, relaxed, and ready to study, and it understood that this is positive, right? So not just using keywords, right? We could do that ourselves. right? We don't need NLP to do that. We could search good, right? So this is why we do NLPs, right? Students stop by to study together and talk through materials. That's viewed as positive. It is positive, right? Seen as collaborative. Had our first meeting, talked about strategies. This is constructive. It's seen as positive, right? So there's our sentiment analysis overall. And then you can see below there too, that in regard to study and studying, support, and concerns, there was one negative entry on concerns. This cluster breakdown is very useful. It ended up being so useful for us. So what we see here is that there, again, right, we're getting this consensus that there is a lot of focus, right? When we look at the top main topics, when we combine that with this cluster, there's a lot of focus on academics. That's not necessarily bad, right? But keep in mind, as we walk through this, keep in mind the mission of the McNair program. Our mission here is grad school attainment. Are academics a component of that? Yes, but there's a gap. We'll get to that. So we've got study sessions, activities related to academics and coursework. Again, semester planning and updates. I would argue, right, that's kind of falls into that first group as well, right? In a way, most of this had to do with semester planning for courses. Research and scholar management, we expect that to be low here. Keep in mind, this is assistant director data, right? So, and so research is really for my data. Support and independence, we're looking at 10 entries. That's a bit low. I think that it's possible that this is due to ChatGPT not doing a great job reading what support looks like. So yeah, contact notes, right? Critical gaps. This is interesting. Unmentioned topics, publication, publishing. That's probably going to be on my line though. That's a part of what I discuss with scholars. So not too concerned about that. Doctorate, PhD planning, that's concerning. Letters of rec, fellowship, NSF funding, financial prep for grad school, statement of purpose, CV. Now, again, could be some errors in ChatGPT analysis, could be some issues in wording difference, right? Again, these are only notes with the assistant director. What we'd like to look at in the future is, hey, we did other activities. Let's incorporate that into this. Now, with our domain knowledge, we know that there were grad prep specific activities. So again, our level of concern at this point, right, is something that all staff are going to get together on and then think about, okay, where were those other components, right? How crucial is that when we look at this? Rarely mentioned GRE, that's because most schools don't require it anymore. Again, domain-specific knowledge is crucial. Human AI collaboration is crucial. Presentations, because that's my end, cool. Interview prep, yep, a little concerned about that. Funding, a little concerned about that. So now let's shift to our case study. Again, so exciting. I highly encourage you to look at this portion of the paper and to watch our other video. This was such an exciting analysis. Claude did an excellent job. Highly recommend for this kind of individual analysis. So here is what Claude found. There's very good coverage discussing research, good coverage. So these are all the notes for one scholar, right? So let's keep that in mind. I want to make sure I emphasize that these are from all staff for one scholar. Okay, so that coverage of research that we're seeing here is because now it's incorporating my notes. A lot of attention to personal development and well-being from our assistant director, regular check-ins on grad school application progress. Claude just may have done a better job of reading that, right? So that's something we need to pick apart. Remember, part of this is for us to compare these two platforms. What are gaps? Limited explicit discussion about PhD pathways, limited coverage of research funding opportunities. Again, that funding component, that is something that I think we do need to do a better job on and work on a little bit better. This last one was so cool. So Claude actually took the identities of our student, this specific student, into account. And it told us, again, please look at the whole paper, there needs to be more focus on academic identity development. And what Claude said was, given that this student is a member of an underrepresented minoritized group, and we were just like, oh my gosh, yes. And he gave more details on it. But it was just wonderful to see this platform, point out this kind of flaw. Like, who is this person? Are you assisting this person with their development as an academic, given their identities? So cool. Was really impressed with it. So let's do a little discussion on each of these. The quantitative analysis. Again, maybe we're seeing that higher engagement's related to grad school entry, and we have to take in mind, well, okay, the engagement metric incorporates application behaviors. Do these imply enrollment? What can we learn? What's our opportunity here? It might be kind of like, well, it incorporates, grad application. Doesn't that kind of imply grad school entry? No, it doesn't, right? What if we have a scholar, and we actually do have a couple of examples of this, who scored really high on engagement metrics, even in that graduate category, but did not matriculate, did not enter and enroll in a graduate program? What's happening there? What are we missing in our support such that this scholar engaged in the program, right, including that grad application process, but did not end up enrolling? That's something that we need to look at and that we need to internally examine. STEM versus non-STEM, we want to just keep an eye on that. We want to keep an eye on that closely. McNair at the national level does tend to emphasize more support for STEM. Again, if you want to have a conversation about that, if you're in TRIO, please do reach out. There's a lot, that's a complex issue. So far, we're seeing CSU MSP programming. That's how we abbreviate CSU McNair Scholars Program. Appears to be effective for this sample. We're not going to make any broad generalizations at this time. But this kind of analysis does seem to be useful in perhaps, future with a bigger sample, predicting these kinds of things. So that contact notes, right? We're seeing that current meeting focus really is on coursework and grades. And so our critical gap here is grad school preparation activities. Again, the staff, we all need to get together and kind of go, well, we provided support here and here, like, is that really a gap? And I think staff, we've had some preliminary discussions about, yeah, there may be a gap there. What can we do about that? So looking at the Gen AI platforms, this was so exciting for me because again, what I wanted to do is, like the custom analysis that we did for SSS. So this was like, using a spacey library in our, some other stuff like that. Not going to dig into the statistical details too deeply, but we did that analysis for SSS on their contact notes. And then the question I got, from so many folks, like, is, well, we're not statisticians, right? We don't know how to do this. So if you don't know, my background is in math and physics and statistics. So that was accessible, right? What is something we can do that's accessible for us? So this portion, this comparison is really exciting, right? What are we seeing? So we used a ChatGPT 4.5 Pro account. It did very well with large data sets, broad analysis. Once we picked out those topics, detailed output, but the contextual depth was clearly not as good. And I found ChatGPT to have more frequent hallucinations, and this is just an overfitting. And I think that's what happened in that big phase one, is we made this broad yet kind of specific request, and it was trying to overfit, right? And it did something called hallucinating. So it kind of just came up with stuff, right? It said, it gave one of our scholars names and said, this person is a staff member, right? Just came up with it out of the blue, right? So interesting stuff. Google AI hallucinations if you haven't heard of that before. It did perform well on that program-wide pattern recognition. I was very impressed with that cluster analysis. So again, look at the paper. I was impressed. Thought it did a good job on that clustering. And that probably more than anything gave us some really good insights. Claude 3.7 Sonnet, I was very impressed. This is an excellent platform for this kind of individual student analysis. We just recently bought a pro account. So, in future work, we're going to use the Claude Pro and maybe do something similar to what we did with ChatGPT. That way we can get a direct comparison. I will tell you that I did do an individual student analysis using ChatGPT, using the same prompting as in this study, and it was not good. So highly recommend Claude for this. You can use a free account to do this analysis. That's very important for TRIO programs right now because, as we know, budgets aren't great. Claude accounted for identity and bias, provided really good contextually relevant recommendations, and it does a better job of mimicking this understanding of student humanity. Our key findings, right? Maybe we're seeing engagement is related to grad school entry. Students are hopefully we're starting to see that they're engaged similarly, regardless of background. Our current meetings really heavily emphasize academics and to an extent research. That seems fairly appropriate, but there is a critical gap in grad school preparation. AI tools do show promise for program-wide and individualized analysis. And I would say for that individualized analysis, I would say there's a lot of promise. And in fact, we're working on incorporating that into our programs now. I do think that that is feasible, but we want to be careful because we're gonna talk a little bit about limitations. So some recommendations that we received, some of these are valid and some of these are probably not so good. This was for the recommendations from ChatGPT, to be clear. Structured templates with standardized fields, that's not always a great idea. Again, reach out to me if you kind of want to know why. Checkboxes and drop downs, also has not been shown to be super effective. That actually came from that not being super useful came from the SSS analysis. If you have questions about that one, let me know. I can share that work with you. Clearly separating narrative reflection from factual, that's a pretty useful tip there. Enhanced student support, more structured grad school prep activities. Again, let's think about what activities we're already doing. Milestone tracking, yep, we need to do that. We need to do a better job, I think, of deadlines and that kind of thing. Provide targeted workshops. Again, this was something that was done. So, staff, we need to, use our human brains and our domain knowledge to think these through. Discussions and limitations. For that quantitative analysis, these small sample sizes, super unbalanced groups, looking at the NLP, GenAI analysis this technology is still really in its infancy, it's subject to errors. We just need to be so careful about using it. We have to think about ethical considerations, right? So a big thing for me is no last names, nothing private whatsoever in your student contact notes, right? You need to make sure that you examine those notes, right? And that you provide staff with guidance and training. I can give you information or some assistance with that if you reach out to me on what is appropriate to include in student notes if you're going to be putting this into an out-of-the-box solution, right? If you're doing a custom solution, we didn't have to worry as much with SSS, right? We're working with people who have access to student data, right, already at CSU. Yeah, reach out if you have questions about that. We need really careful human interpretation of GenAI output. In the paper emphasizes the collaboration between humans and AI in the other video that we have and other presentation that we have. If you don't already have access to that or don't know where to find it, please do reach out. In that one, I go a little more deeply into human AI collaboration and how important it is, right? When we think about increasing the intelligence of an organization or a program, that we navigate that very carefully. We're very important, right? What does Gen AI allow us to do? It allows us, right, to bring our full selves to work, to bring the meaning to the work. So again, please do watch that video or look at that presentation. Future work, we're really excited. So again, this is so preliminary, right? We want to incorporate data from spring 2025 through fall 2025 and maybe beyond. We're thinking another phase of this study to be completed in spring 2026. We want to leverage those larger sample sizes, right, to get some more generalizable findings. Extended NLP, so, looking at impact over time, right? So of course, we've got this kind of preliminary thing. What do we see, right, when we're starting to look further out, when we're looking at spring 25, fall 25, spring 26? We'd also like to do an additional NLP on like scholar program assessment feedback that we're collecting right now. And then scholar research. So we'll see how that looks, right? Some scholar research data. What I'm also really excited about is an integrated NLP and quantitative recruitment analysis. What could this look like? So looking at predictors of program engagement from recruitment materials, which are text. So yeah, more to come on that. Thank you so much. Again, here are the references. This first one, the American Statistical Association one I mentioned, is great. I highly recommend looking through these references. These are great studies, all very interesting work, very new work. So thank you so much. If you want more information, have questions, if you'd like a consultation, if you want to give feedback, if you have questions, if you're a statistician, you're like, I don't know about this part, please do reach out. Like again, this is very preliminary. My training is in statistics, but we all have our different domains of expertise. Please reach out. Let me know what you think. If you want to collaborate, we're already working with some folks at some other places, some other institutions. If you want to be a part of that, please reach out. Grace.ivins, Ivins, at colostate.edu and snowwebb at colostate.edu. I will say summer 2025, Snow's not going to be here. Snow's a grad student. Snow's going to be doing greater, bigger things. So if it's in the summer, please reach out to me. Thank you so much for watching this. We really appreciate you engaging with our program and what we're trying to do here. Have a wonderful day.